Solver2D is an open source project for creating and comparing 2D rigid body solvers that are appropriate for video games. So far, I've created 8 solvers with various flavors of projected Gauss-Seidel, temporal Gauss-Seidel, and position-based dynamics. In this video, I'll show quite a few samples where I'm comparing the solvers and pushing them to their limits. This sample shows a parabolic arch with some boxes stacked on top. So this is going to really be stressing the solver's friction and stacking stability. So first off is PGS. We can see this solver is just too basic to handle it. So let's go to the next one. Here's PGS NGS, does a bit better, but it still is not accurate enough to handle the simulation. Okay, here's PGS NGS with the block solver. This is what's in Box2D version 2, and this one has a good enough accuracy to handle this problem, obviously. And one cool thing is we can look at the forces in here and see how they line up. Kind of gives you a sense for what's going on in the simulation. All right, next up, PGS Soft. This is using soft constraints, and it's doing quite well with just 4 iterations here. And here's TGS Sticky, which is using friction that has like a position correction. And this particular test shows something very interesting about TGS Sticky. It actually kind of, the friction actually can kind of bounce back. So I'm going to restart this, and you should be able to see the friction kind of behave a bit springy. So it kind of lifts up after it sags a bit. It's a pretty interesting behavior. But yeah, this solver handles it. And then here's TGS Soft. This one is doing well. What's interesting is when you have a substepping solver, the impulses are actually smaller. They'll be roughly 1/4 if you have 4 primary iterations or 4 substeps. That basically divides your impulse values by 4. And then the next one is TGS NGS. This solver is handling it, but I'm not sure if we can see. Yeah, you can kind of see with the impulses that it's kind of wiggling a bit. And if we zoom in, we should see some movement, some subtle movement. So it's accurate enough to handle this, but not fully stable. And there's XBBD. I just haven't had good luck with getting accurate friction with XBBD. Sometimes in games, you'll have a bad setup where objects are confined into too small of a space. And it'd be good if the solver can handle that and not have too much energy and kind of stay calm. So let's look at how the different solvers do. This sample, there's a static box. It's hollow, just made of 4 capsules, and I'm putting a whole bunch of circles in that box, more than can fit. So let's look at PGS. So this solver is not calm. It's got Baumgart stabilization, and it's really fighting to push things apart. It's very springy. And here's PGS NGS. This is basically why I implemented NGS back in Box2D version 1. It's just very relaxed. You can even look at, there's no impulses going on here because the position correction is not feeding into the velocities or the impulses. Identical behavior from the block solver. The block solver really only does extra special stuff for stacking boxes and things like that. Here's PGS Soft. This one's doing quite well, but there is some significant internal impulses there. TGS Sticky. This is using, Baumgart stabilization with substepping. It doesn't use warm starting, so it's not terribly energetic, but it is still kind of wiggly. There's definitely some built up energy in there. Here's TGS Soft. This is using soft constraints, so it is spring-like. There are definitely some internal forces there. And then TGS NGS, again, NGS showing its strength. There's going to be no internal impulses there. So it's very relaxed. And XPBD, it's trying really hard to push objects apart. That's what position-based dynamics does, is it directly manipulates position, trying to push things apart. That feeds into the velocity. It's very energetic. And you can see there's even, position-derived internal forces. And they're just all over the place. This is a fun sample. It's called the double domino effect. It does require reasonably accurate friction and mild stacking stability. I'm just going to roll through this. This is PGS. That's the double domino effect. PGS NGS. I believe you can find several YouTube videos demonstrating this effect in real life. So far, every solver is handling it. I don't know what happened with TGS Sticky. I don't know. TGS Soft. Handles it well. TGS NGS. There was a minor setback there. Almost got it. XPBD. Again, I just can't get friction working well with the solver. This is the friction ramp. There are 5 boxes here with varying friction coefficients. And this is testing static and dynamic friction at kind of a basic level. So we want to see some boxes continue to slide if they have lower friction coefficients, but boxes with higher friction coefficients should be able to come to a complete rest on a ramp. All right, so PGS does fine. PGS, NGS. Also does fine. The block solver is basically identical. Let's go to the PGS soft. This one looks very similar. All right, it's doing fine. TGS sticky. The sticky friction is a bit aggressive and it makes frictions stronger in some ways. TGS soft. Looks fine to me. TGS, NGS. Looks good. And then XPBD. Friction with XPBD is either really strong or really weak. So maybe I have a bug, I don't know. This particular test is kind of fun just to run all solvers simultaneously. So let's look at that. So we know XPBD and TGS sticky are outliers. And we can see that even among these other solvers, they don't, they each have their own kind of different, slightly different behavior, slightly different outcome, which I don't find too surprising. Yep. This sample tests high mass ratios. I found this particular test in Peel by Pierre Tierdemann. And what this does is has several high mass boxes being dropped onto pyramids. So the blue boxes, or cyan, whatever color that is, those have a mass of 4. And then the leftmost top box has a mass of 400. And then the middle top box has a mass of 800. And then the top right box has a mass of 1200. So we're looking at a mass ratio of 100 to 1, 200 to 1, and 300 to 1. And let's see how the PGS solver does. And I've kept those high mass boxes red so you can follow them. Yeah, so PGS is not really handling high mass ratios. All right, PGS, NGS, doing a bit better. Still a fair bit of energy. That energy, it's not springiness. What it is warm starting energy. That's a effect you see in any solver with warm starting regardless if it's using soft constraints or NGS or Baumgart. Here's the block solver. Doing a little bit better. PGS soft. Soft constraints are pretty resilient to high mass ratios. They have a little bit of give, and that helps to kind of create like a shock absorber for those high mass ratios. There's also, as part of that soft constraint, significant damping that helps remove that high energy. Okay, so TGS sticky. This one, it did pretty well on not having that kind of warm starting energy that you see in those other solvers. That's because TGS sticky doesn't have warm starting. That's part of its design. All right, TGS soft. TGS soft is handling this high mass ratio very well. The reason is, like we saw with PGS soft, the soft constraint has that kind of shock absorber damper combo that's pretty resilient, and then the substepping that TGS does also helps to kind of micromanage that high mass ratio. All right, TGS, NGS. What we're seeing there is that warm starting energy. The soft constraints, the PGS soft and TGS soft, they do have warm starting, but they're able to kind of dampen out that warm starting energy. And then XBBD, that one, yeah, it didn't handle the high mass ratio, and there's no warm starting in XBBD, but there is a kind of a very significant spring-like behavior. This test is another high mass ratio example. Let's look at the masses here. Here I'm just using like a uniform density. So the boxes on the bottom are a mass of 1. The box on the top is a mass of 400, and that's purely because it's just larger. Both the large box and the small box have the same density. And so I'm going to be dropping this large box on these small boxes. So let's just go ahead and look at PGS. So it just straight up pushes those small boxes through the floor. The relevance for this test is what you find a lot in games with destruction. If you have destruction, you have some large pieces and you have some small pieces. Inevitably, there's going to be some small pieces on the bottom and some large pieces fall on top of them. Now, you can either, in this case, those small pieces just go straight through the floor, or it may not get put through the floor, but it might sit there and jitter. In this case, it's just being pushed right through the floor. Hopefully you have some sort of kill plane or something to catch those objects in your game and remove them from the world. And hopefully those small objects are not, important for your gameplay. All right, PGS, NGS, same story. It's pushing it right through. The block solver, pushing it right through. PGS soft, pushing it right through. And this is getting pretty repetitive, but there is a surprise here. Yes, TGS soft manages to catch that big box. The solver is pretty special. It has some nice properties. Yeah, and there's no jitter. I don't think there is. Let's zoom in. And then we can look at the impulses. Yep, it's handling it. I think that's the kind of the power of the substepping. All right, let's go to the next one. Yeah, I believe all these other solvers just push the boxes through. Here's a scenario that happens a lot in games where objects are placed in the world with some initial overlap. They're not precisely placed in the level editor that you might have, or they're spawned from script in an awkward location. And there's some initial overlap that you have to deal with. So maybe you have some object on a table and it starts out kind of penetrated into the table a bit, and then something wakes it up. You would like it that that object doesn't shoot up to the ceiling. So let's look at this scenario where there's a small pyramid with boxes that have 25% initial overlap. So that's PGS, and PGS is based on Baumgart, so it's very spring-like, and objects kind of shoot apart. There's PGS NGS, and that is one of the superpowers of NGS is its ability to push objects apart gently without adding kinetic energy. All right, here's PGS NGS block solver, very similar, very low energy. PGS soft is using soft constraints. Now soft constraints are spring-like, but they also have damping. So I've set this constraint up so that it has significant damping on contact, and it creates a more graceful overlap recovery. There's TGS sticky. TGS sticky is using Baumgart stabilization, and that is, unlike soft constraints, it's basically pure spring, so there's not any damping there. And so that's why we see some significant energy there for dealing with overlap. I should also mention that many solvers have something with overlap recovery where it limits how fast objects can be pushed apart, some tuning value. And I think that's a good thing to have. However, you have to be careful not to be too aggressive with that tuning value, because then your stacking kind of falls apart and objects will begin to sink into each other. So it is suboptimal that there's this tuning value, and you kind of have to find like the right value for your game. So generally what I would steer towards is having that be kind of loose so that you get good stacking, but then have like a soft constraint or NGS that can damp out that energy. All right, there's TGS soft, and that does well, but actually not as well as PGS soft. Let's look at that again. It's fine. It's pushing objects a bit further apart than I would like. There is TGS NGS, and I think this is definitely the winner in this test. It just pushes objects apart very quickly, very low energy, very accurate. And then there's XBBD. XBBD is very spring-like. There is a stage that is a velocity stage that's recommended in the position-based rigid body paper. I have that implemented, but it doesn't always prevent objects from flying apart. It works in some situations, but not all. Apparently, it is universal that physics programmers love stacking boxes, and then I am no exception. So here we have a very large pyramid with 100 boxes along the base, and let's see how PGS does. All right, so the original Box2D Lite solver just can't handle this. PGS NGS. This is Box2D version 1. doing better, but still lots of waviness, lots of things falling down. Let's look at PGS NGS block. So this is Box2D version 2. A lot of waving going on. And falling apart a bit. Okay, next up, PGS Soft. This solver is doing remarkably well for a PGS solver. Again, we're using 4 primary iterations, 2 secondary iterations, and 60 Hz simulation. So pretty stingy on the iteration count for all these tests. And the PGS Soft, it is stabilized. It's doing very well. TGS Sticky. So again, this solver is using no warm starting. All it has is it is storing the local friction anchors across frames and trying to maintain those friction anchors. There's some heuristics that tell it when to drop those anchors and pick up new anchors, but that's not sufficient for this this test. So that's, yeah, it's pretty cool how it falls apart though. I'll give it that. All right, TGS Soft. So TGS Soft just kind of seems like it was born for this test. You can barely see any movement, so I'll restart it and you'll just watch it. It just has a brief kind of droop and settle. Yeah, very, the solver likes to stack, I guess. Big stacks. All right, TGS Soft. So this solver is trying too hard to be perfectly rigid. And I believe what's happening is there's errors in the warm starting that just are not damped out like you'll find with a soft constraint. So TGS NGS is just kind of a victim of trying too hard. And then XBBD, we can see the friction is just not working with this test. All right, let's take a look at some problems with joints. So this is a ball and chain. The chain is made out of 40 small capsules, or at least small relative to this circle at the end. The circle is about 672 times heavier than each link. So this is testing quite a high mass ratio. So this is the PGS solver. We can see the solver is kind of struggling. There's a lot of oscillation, a lot of gaps, but it is staying stable. It is staying together, which is pretty cool for such a simple solver. All right, PGS NGS. This problem is kind of like the Achilles heel for NGS. It falls apart and it just doesn't recover. Same story for the block solver. It's basically identical for joints. You can see, yes, it falls apart. PGS Soft. This is kind of like PGS, but damped a bit more, and it does recover. But there's still some oscillation. The links are really struggling to stay together. TGS Sticky. This is using substepping and Baumgart stabilization in the joints. And there's a bit of oscillation, but it does hold together. You can see those joints. stretching a little bit, but yeah, it's stabilized quite a bit. All right, TGS soft. This is using soft constraints in the joints, just like PGS soft, but it's substepping. So less oscillation. There's still some stretching. You might wonder, okay, yeah, I'm using 4 iterations here. Would I get less stretching if I'm using 8 iterations? So let's see how that looks. Yes, that turns out to be the case. I've tuned the stiffness of the joints to be such that it can sustain this high mass ratio given enough iterations. All right, let's dial this back down to 4. We'll see it kind of stretch out a bit. Okay, TGS, NGS. Now here I am just with 4 iterations, but TGS, NGS is really holding things together very tightly. The solver is trying to be as rigid as possible, and it shows. And then here's XPBD. There is some high frequency oscillation, but it is holding together quite well. Now when you look at this test, what's interesting is like how far does each solver stretch? So I'm going to turn on all the solvers that are stable. And let's just restart it. And I have a kind of a fast forward mode that lets me advance forward through time very quickly. All right, we can see the PGS solver is just oscillating. Okay, so let's hide that guy. So we go in here. Okay, TGS, NGS, the least amount of stretch. XPBD is next, but we could see XPBD is actually kind of oscillating there. Yeah, that's the other solvers are not oscillating like that. And then, so hide TGS, NGS, XPBD, and then there is it looks like PGS soft and TGS soft are identical. Yes, they are. And then TGS sticky. This test comes from the Rapier physics engine. It's written in Rust, and they posted some benchmarks online, actually comparing with Box2D. I find this is a very interesting test. I don't think it's realistic that you would put this into a game, but it does stress the solver in a very interesting way. So here I have a grid of 100 by 100 circles, and they're all connected horizontally and vertically by hinge joints or revolute joints. So if we zoom in, there's basically a hinge halfway between every circle going vertically and horizontally. If you're trying to do something like this and you want it to be like a mesh, I would probably use a distance constraint, maybe from center to center. I don't think the rotation of the circles is interesting for this or desired. Nevertheless, this is how the problem is set up. It's highly overconstrained. So it does do a good job of showing how your solver handles a high amount of being overconstrained. So I'm going to just run the PGS one. Yeah, and this one just blows up. It's unstable. So just simple PGS Baumgart stabilization is unstable. Okay, PGS NGS. This kind of falls apart. It doesn't recover. Yeah, this is how Box2D version 2 handles this problem. The block solver is going to be the same. I'll skip over that. PGS soft. It is kind of struggling here. I think it does a bit better than the NGS solvers. It does recover. It just can't cope with all the constraints, all the complexity of this scenario. TGS sticky. It's doing quite well. There's no warm starting energy building up, yet it still kind of holds together fairly well. So not bad. I'm not sure why it's asymmetric like that. It's probably just has to do with order constraints. TGS soft. Substepping is really helping a lot here. Just dealing with the complexity and kind of by substepping, the problem becomes more linear. And the softness is helping it cope with the over-constrained setup. TGS NGS, that just blows up. And we've seen this before, TGS NGS trying to be as rigid as possible. And I believe the warm starting energy can just kind of get out of hand. And yeah, I would not ship this solver. Okay, XPBD. So XPBD doesn't like this problem. And I thought about this, and I thought, this is like cloth, and position-based dynamics should do well with cloth. But this is not set up like cloth at all. With cloth, you would not be using hinge constraints. You would be using distance constraints between the centers. I believe if it was set up like that, it wouldn't be as kind of over-constrained. And I believe XPBD would do a better job. One of the things I've been looking at with Solver2D is simulation far from the origin. And it's kind of been an interesting challenge to see how far I can push single precision. So I've done a lot of work on the solver to make sure everything is done in local coordinates as much as possible, and only involve the world position of the rigid bodies when absolutely necessary. So this is a pyramid that's around 120 kilometers from the origin. I have put a length scale in the bottom left corner. That red horizontal line indicates a meter. The length scale is important when we're looking at large coordinates because smaller objects are more challenging to simulate at large coordinates. All right, well, let's take a look. So there's PGS. It's definitely having some issues, some wiggling. PGS NGS is doing quite well. You can see some mouse interaction there. I'm just kind of throwing things around to see how they react. It seems kind of okay. The block solver is doing fine. PGS soft looks like it's at the origin. It's hard to tell that it's even far from the origin. TGS sticky has some jitter. TGS soft is doing well. Things are rotated a little bit. The behavior seems reasonable. TGS, NGS, it's a little bit energetic. And then XPBD still has some friction problems. But it is stable. And very little overlap. There is some jitter though. Yeah. All right, next I want to look at simulating ragdolls far from the origin, in particular a pile of ragdolls. Now I'm going to just start by showing you what it looks like at the origin. So here's PGS, and this has some jitter, some oscillations. It is not easy to simulate a pile of ragdolls, even at the origin. Also make note of the red horizontal line at the bottom. That's the length scale, so that's a meter. So that kind of gives you a sense for the size of the ragdolls. Let's look at the other solvers. What you're going to see is basically all the other solvers are quite stable at the origin. No jitter. So at least we have a good starting point for the other solvers. Now I don't have joint limits for XPBD, so I'm not going to show XPBD with the ragdolls. All right, here we are at 25 kilometers from the origin, PGS. A little bit of jitter. PGS, NGS. No jitter. PGS, NGS block solve. Also no jitter. PGS soft. A little bit of jitter on this guy down here. TGS sticky. I'm not seeing any jitter. Yeah, doing well. TGS soft. I'm not seeing any jitter. TGS, NGS. A little bit of jitter on this. Very small. All right, now we have the ragdolls out at 100 kilometers from the origin. Here's PGS. You can see my graphics rendering for this capsules and the circles is breaking down. There's a little bit of jitter. But not any more than I saw at the origin for this guy. PGS, NGS. It seems fine. That block solver. That seems fine as well. PGS soft. It's hard to tell if that's jitter or it's definitely some graphical things going on. Looks like jitter. TGS sticky. Also some jitter in TGS soft. That seems pretty stable. I'm not seeing any jitter. Finally, TGS NGS. Looks fine. Finally, I'd like to show a Ragdoll stress test. This is just kind of fun to watch. I've been testing TGS Soft a lot. I think it's probably going to be the solver I use in Box2D version 3. Has some very nice properties, as you've seen, and I think it's worthwhile to really push hard on the solver to make sure that it's actually a real substantial improvement over version 2. Thanks for watching.